Thank you everyone for joining this lecture. This is a lecture that's very much based on one I gave just 3 days ago to the Silver Society, or on behalf of the Silver Society, and now we get the opportunity to record it and tailor it to that. So it's a very similar lecture. It's also based on one I gave in 2015, but dare I say it, much improved and changed. I'm Anthony Birnbaum, and I run a gallery called the Pear Tree Collection, which is really a reflection of my passion for the arts and crafts movement and arts and crafts silver in particular. Now I'm wearing white gloves, and the purpose of today's lecture and the setup I've got here is that I can demonstrate some specific pieces. So I'm going to kick off and introduce the lecture by showing you this, which is, for those less familiar with the area, a Liberty silver biscuit box designed by Archibald Knox, and it dates to 1900. And so the question we'll kind of ask ourselves through this lecture is, how did something like this get produced in the Victorian period, with its modernity from the geometry, the Celtic Art Nouveau design, and perhaps the medieval touch with a modern twist of the enamels and the stones. So that is a classic, I'll say, arts and crafts Art Nouveau piece, and I'll come on to that. And that's where we're heading in this lecture. So if that doesn't interest you or excite you, you can turn off now. Moving forward, about the key themes for the lecture. The key themes are very much around an introduction to arts and crafts silver and the key silversmiths. So I hope that's going to interest many of you. For those very familiar with the area, though, I think you'll be more interested in the other areas of this lecture, which is the timeline of arts and crafts silver development. And I'm very much going to show how there was this period in the 1890s of really authentic silver development, and then how, under various influences, including the Art Nouveau, you get this incredible blossoming in post 1899, post 1900 of really fabulous modernist silver. Why shaping modernity? Well, I've just touched on that, of course, around design, but I'll also be talking about the social history of the movement and how that shaped modernity around workshop design and modern post-war silver, contemporary silversmiths. And finally, I think this lecture will convey my own passion. I certainly hope it does. For those that know Christopher Dresser, who is the true modernist of 19th century Britain, I'm not touching on him. He doesn't really fit in the arts and crafts silver bracket, albeit a very important modernist in the timeline of design. So let me start by saying, what is arts and crafts? Not arts and crafts silver, what is arts and crafts? And as this quote summarizes, or quite concisely, it's a protest against that so-called industrial progress which produces shoddy wares, the cheapness of which is paid for by the lives of their producers and the degradation of their users. And I picked this quote because it really shows the three things that arts and crafts was focused on. And only one is partially design, and that's really the point. It was very much focused on a radical protest, if you like, socialist protest against capitalism and industrialization. It was hugely focused on employee well-being and restoring respect, if you like, to the work of the employee. And only thirdly was it to do with the consumer. And it's perhaps that third part of this quote which hints at William Morris's quote, "Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful." But only design was only a small aspect of the movement. So coming on to arts and crafts silver, specifically within that movement, there's a very specific theme, which is that it is, sorry, bear with me, it is a later stage of the arts and crafts movement. So if William Morris really, say, started the movement in the late 1850s, 1860s, silver does not really get going until 1893. And on the right, I say, why is that? And that's really because I think silver is not especially socialist. It's expensive. It's like gold in that sense. It's quite bright. It's quite clearly quite a wealthy, luxurious item. And that didn't fit well with the arts and crafts movement at its core. But in addition, I think it requires real specialist skill to work with. If anyone's had a go, it's really hard to manipulate. And I think that put off a lot of the, say, more amateur approach of the arts and crafts movement. So what was it less focused on? It was less focused on radical socialism this later period. And it was less focused on design in terms of historicism and medievalism, and less focused on Gothic revival. And that was the passage of time led to that, partly through the aesthetic and Japanese influence, changed design perspectives. And on the social side, you had a sort of new socialism that I will very loosely call social democracy coming to influence the hardcore new Karl Marx-based socialism of William Morris, but that's another story. So what did the later movement focus on? It really focused on education, workshop organization, a return to rural roots, for which you can read the health of the worker and the well-being of the worker physically, and only partially did it focus again on design. So for me, this later movement focused, if you like, on the micro aspects of social change versus the perhaps macro aspects of the movement, which is true socialism from that period. And so in focusing on these micro things like education, like workshop organization, personally for me, it conveys real resonance even today, and really important areas today. So for example, Charles Ashby, we'll come on to this, but Charles Ashby and Hardwick Rawnsley from the Keswick School of Industrial Art, and also the founder of the National Trust, were really highly influential in this later period. So I just want to leave one more thought with you around this before I get on to probably what you're expecting, which is to talk about silver. And that is to talk about these pioneers of change and Charles Ashby in this social history. So Charles Ashby was focused on design as well as social change. He talked about, in that first quote, the way you learn in the average workshop is not the right way. It is essential that they, the apprentice silversmith, learn design before execution, a theme that would resonate today, but definitely didn't resonate then. But perhaps more importantly, and where his huge focus was, he says, we shall sweep all of the profits over and above the percentage on capital into a common workshop fund for distribution amongst all the men. And that is very resonant to today's way of running businesses, of course, in terms of employee ownership and bonus systems and so on. Very radical then. And it really makes interesting reading to focus on some of Ashby's work. In 1894, he wrote a book, A Few Chapters in Workshop Reconstruction and Citizenship. And he rushed this out in 1894. He was so passionate and felt it was such an urgent matter to convey. And it's an incredible read. It's a difficult read and an odd read, but in its substance, it really is laying out how to run a modern business, and it resonates completely today. It looks and sounds like you could be designing a tech company and how they're run with their flat organization and their leadership from the design or R&D side, excuse me. And so it's a really interesting insight into Ashby and what he was doing in his terms around the Guild of Handicraft and workshop organization. On the right, you've got Reverend Hardwick Rawnsley. I won't read the quotes, but he was very focused, of course, on helping, in this case, Keswick workers, employees, find alternative living, giving them more skills, effectively keeping them off the streets and actually away from alcoholism in some cases. And if you read again the objectives of himself around the Keswick School, there's nothing about design. It's all about the employee. So let me pause there before I do talk about what you're expecting me to, I'm sure, which is design and silver, and just hold up this piece and explain why social history matters. So here is a very humble piece of silver. It's a small dish. It's one of a pair, in fact. If you can see, it's got some fairly basic repousse around the edge. If you can see that, the edge is a very crude rim. It's all bent and wonky, and that's not with the passage of time. This thing is made from what I'm sure is a Georgian platter and is an incredible gauge of silver. But you hold it and you feel that social history. You can feel the workmanship that's gone into it and the care and the learning. And I think in that regard, it's like other areas of silver collecting. So perhaps for spoon collectors, if you collect a 16th, 15th century spoon, it's a humble object, but it talks to you in terms of the history it's come from and the history it's seen. And I think in the world of arts and crafts silver, and certainly for me, a huge part is not the aesthetic of the silver, but it's the social history that's within that, that piece. So I'm going to pause there and move on now to design.